Most people are afraid of silence. Not the silence of an empty room, the silence of a charged moment, the silence that arrives in the middle of a conversation when someone has said something and the expected response does not come immediately. I want you to understand something powerful. Silence is a tool. When you go quiet after making your point, most people will feel an almost physical discomfort and they will talk. They'll backtrack, over-explain, or give you something they never planned to. The moment they speak first, you've won that exchange. Let's dive straight into business. Machiavelli never wrote a chapter on silence explicitly, but silence as a form of power runs through everything. He observed about how the most effective rulers of his time conducted themselves. The ruler who spoke less than expected commanded more than those who spoke constantly. The advisor who gave their opinion only when directly asked carried more weight than the one who offered it freely and frequently. The man who could sit in a room full of competing voices and remain still, gathering, observing, deciding nothing visibly, wielded an influence that the loudest voices in the room could not match. This was not accident. It was not temperament. It was strategy. The deliberate deployment of silence as the most sophisticated and least understood tool of psychological influence available to human beings in social interaction. Most people spend their entire lives on the wrong side of this dynamic without ever understanding why. They speak when silence would serve them better. They explain when the absence of explanation would be more powerful. They rush to fill every pause in every conversation with the compulsive generosity of people who have confused speaking with thinking and noise with presence. And they wonder why certain people, quieter people, people who seem to do less and say less, consistently accumulate more respect, more influence, more genuine authority in every room they inhabit. The answer is silence, specifically the mastery of silence as a psychological instrument. The understanding of what silence communicates that words cannot, the capacity to exist comfortably in charged pauses that most people find unbearable, the discipline of speaking only when speech adds something that the silence was failing to provide. This is what we are going to build today, not the performance of silence, the actual mastery of it, the understanding deep enough that when the moment arrives, when the charged pause opens in front of you and every instinct you have is pushing you to fill it, you will have something stronger than instinct available. You will have understanding. And understanding in the right moment is the only thing that reliably overrides the body's compulsion to speak. Let us begin with what silence actually communicates at the psychological level, because silence is not simply the absence of speech. In social interaction, silence is a form of communication as active and as specific as any words. It carries content. It produces effects. It shapes the internal experience of the people who encounter it in ways that words, paradoxically, cannot always reach. The first thing silence communicates is self-sufficiency. The person who does not need to fill every pause with speech is demonstrating, in the most direct way available, that their internal state does not require external management, that they are not dependent on the conversation to regulate how they feel, that the silence is not threatening to them because they are not using the conversation as the primary source of their psychological stability. This is one of the most powerful signals that a human being can broadcast in social interaction. Because the need to speak, the compulsion to fill silence, is one of the most visible expressions of social anxiety that exists. It announces, to everyone who knows how to read it, that the speaker's internal state is uncomfortable with the pause, that something in the silence is activating the threat response, that the words are not being produced by thought but by the need to end an experience that feels dangerous. The person who sits in silence without distress is announcing the opposite, that they are sufficient to the moment, that the charged pause is not a threat to their stability, that they can be in the discomfort of the open space between words without needing to close it. And this announcement, made without a single word, produces in the people around them a specific response, a recalibration of status, a recognition that this person operates from a different internal foundation than the people who cannot stop speaking. The second thing silence communicates is deliberateness. Every word spoken by a person who is comfortable with silence carries more weight than words produced by a person who speaks continuously, because the silence creates a frame, a context, a standard of economy against which every word is measured. When someone who speaks rarely says something, the rarity itself signals that what is being said has been worth the departure from silence, that it has passed some internal threshold of significance that most speech does not reach. This is why certain people in every environment, the quiet ones, the ones who sit through entire meetings without speaking and then say one thing at the end, seem to produce disproportionate effect with that single contribution. The effect is not entirely about the content of what they said. It is about the silence that surrounded it. The silence functioned as a frame that amplified the content by signaling that the content had been considered, held, weighed against the alternative of continued silence, and found worth saying. The person who speaks constantly cannot produce this effect, not because they are less intelligent or less insightful, but because every word they produce competes with every other word they produce for the listener's attention. There is no frame, no signal of significance, no way for the listener to know which words have been carefully chosen and which are simply the overflow of a mind that releases everything it processes through speech. The third thing silence communicates is that you are not afraid of what the other person thinks of your silence, which is to say, you are not afraid of what the other person thinks of you. This is the most specifically powerful social signal that silence carries because the fear of negative evaluation is the deepest driver of the compulsive speech that fills most social interaction. People speak to manage impressions, to ensure they are not misunderstood, to preempt negative conclusions, to fill the space where an unflattering interpretation might otherwise form. The person who allows the silence to exist, who does not rush to fill it with impression management, is demonstrating that the other person's interpretation is not their primary concern, not because they are indifferent to being understood, because they are not operating from a position of anxiety about how they are perceived. Their sense of their own worth is not contingent on the other person's response to their silence. The silence might be interpreted negatively. They have accepted that possibility and chosen silence anyway. That acceptance, visible in the composed quality of the silence itself, produces in the observer a response that the anxious speaking it was designed to prevent could never produce. It produces respect, the specific form of respect that is reserved for people who are clearly not managing you, who are not performing for your approval, who exist in your presence with a completeness that does not require your confirmation. Now let us go into the specific context where silence operates as a power instrument, and what the mechanics of its use look like in each. The first context is negotiation. Silence in negotiation is perhaps its most studied and most powerful application. Every person who has ever been trained in negotiation at a serious level has been taught one version of the same rule. After you make your offer or state your position, stop talking. Do not elaborate. Do not justify. Do not qualify. State the position and then exist in the silence that follows for as long as the silence requires. This rule exists because of a consistent and well-documented dynamic. The person who speaks first after an offer or a position has been stated is almost always moving toward the other person, is almost always beginning the process of concession, of justification, of weakening their stated position. Not because they have been asked to, because the silence has produced enough discomfort that speaking, any speaking, feels like relief, and the speaking that provides relief in that specific moment is almost always speaking that gives something away. The person who waits, who allows the silence to do its work on the other side of the table, is allowing the other person's discomfort to do the negotiating for them. The silence is applying pressure that no words could apply without triggering defensiveness. It is creating a space that the other person feels the need to fill, and filling it costs them something they had not planned to give. Machiavelli understood this principle in the context of political negotiation. He observed that the rulers who arrived at agreements most favorable to themselves were rarely the ones who argued most forcefully. They were the ones who spoke precisely, stated their position completely, and then fell into a silence that communicated absolute certainty about what they had said. The silence after the statement was not waiting. It was pressure. Invisible, comfortable, entirely deniable pressure that worked on the psychology of the other party in ways that argument could not. In practical terms, the use of silence in negotiation requires one specific preparation that most people do not make. You must be more comfortable with the silence than the other person. You must have done the internal work of separating your emotional need for the outcome from your position. Because if you need the deal more than you are willing to show, the silence will work against you. Your discomfort will break it before theirs does. And the moment you break it, you have conceded the negotiating floor. The preparation is therefore not tactical. It is psychological. Arrive at the negotiation having genuinely processed and accepted the possibility of not reaching agreement. Having genuinely settled the question of what you will do if the silence produces nothing. Having genuinely decoupled the outcome from your self-assessment. Because that decoupling is what allows the silence to remain intact long enough to do its work. The second context is conflict. When someone is angry at you, attacking you, making claims about you that are inaccurate or unfair or simply overwhelming in their emotional intensity, the most natural response is to respond in kind, to meet the energy with equivalent energy, to defend, to explain, to counter-argue, to match the temperature of the room with an equivalent temperature of your own. This response is almost always the wrong response, not because you are wrong in the substance of what you would say, but because responding to the energy of the attack with equivalent energy confirms the frame the attacker has established. It accepts the premise that this is a situation requiring that level of emotional activation. It places you inside the conflict rather than above it. And being inside the conflict, regardless of who is right, is a position of reduced power relative to being above it. Silence in conflict does something that no response can do. It changes the energy of the room without adding to it. The attacker has produced a specific energetic reality, loud, accusatory, charged, designed to produce a specific defensive response that will maintain and escalate the conflict dynamic. When that response does not come, when the expected reaction is replaced by a composed and absolute silence, the energetic reality the attacker created has nowhere to go. It does not find the resistance it was designed to encounter. And energy without resistance does not escalate. It dissipates. The silence is not passive. It is not the silence of someone who has nothing to say or who has been overwhelmed by the attack. It is the silence of a person who has heard everything, registered everything, and chosen, from a position of complete presence and complete composure, not to add to the energy currently in the room. That choice, visible in the quality of the silence, is itself a response. One of the most powerful responses available. It says, I am not available to be activated by this. I am not inside this dynamic with you. I am somewhere the anger cannot reach. Machiavelli wrote about the importance of never appearing to be moved by the provocations of others, not because being moved is weakness in any moral sense, but because being visibly moved by a provocation is information. It tells the person provoking you where the mechanism is, where the lever is that produces the reaction. And a person who knows where your lever is will use it as often as serves their purposes, at times and in contexts of their choosing rather than yours. The silence that greets provocation without flinching removes the information. It says there is no lever here, or if there is, you have not found it. And the person whose provocations are consistently met with composed silence will eventually stop provoking. not out of respect necessarily, out of the practical recognition that the provocation is not producing the intended effect. The third context is leadership and authority. In every group dynamic, every organizational structure, every social hierarchy, there is a consistent relationship between silence and authority. The person who speaks most is almost never the person with the most actual influence. The person who speaks least but most deliberately, whose words are measured against a visible standard of economy, whose silence is as active a presence in the room as their speech, almost always carries disproportionate weight. This relationship is not arbitrary. It reflects something deep in how human beings assess status and authority. In the natural hierarchies of group behavior, the high-status individual does not need to compete for speaking time, does not need to assert themselves against the voices around them, does not need to raise their volume or interrupt or perform confidence. The high-status individual can wait, can be silent, can allow the conversation to move through its necessary complexity, and then arrive, when the moment is right, with the word or the question or the observation that redirects everything. This capacity to wait, to be silent without losing presence, to be still without becoming invisible, is one of the primary behavioral signatures of genuine authority. Not the authority of position or title necessarily. The authority of a person who commands a room by virtue of what they bring to it, of how they hold themselves within it, of the specific quality of their attention, their silence, their unhurried presence in a space where most people are working hard to be noticed. Developing this quality in yourself requires one specific practice above all others: the practice of not speaking in group settings until you have something that is worth the departure from your silence, not a performance of withholding, a genuine standard. Ask yourself before every contribution you make in a group context: does this add something that is not already present in the conversation? Or am I speaking because the silence has become uncomfortable, and speaking is how I manage that discomfort? Apply this standard consistently for 30 days in every professional and social group setting you inhabit. The first effect you will notice is how much you were speaking for the second reason rather than the first. How much of your verbal output in group settings was produced by the need to be seen rather than by genuine content that needed saying. This recognition is uncomfortable. It is also the beginning of the transformation. The second effect you will notice after several weeks of this practice is that when you do speak, the room responds differently. The standard you have been applying to your own speech has been observed, unconsciously, by the people around you. They have registered that you speak rarely and therefore significantly. The frame has been established, and the frame amplifies everything you say within it. The fourth context is intimate relationships. This is the context where the power of silence is most subtle and most frequently misunderstood. Because in intimate relationships, silence is often associated with withdrawal, with coldness, with the kind of punishing distance that is a form of aggression rather than composure. And there is a form of silence in intimate relationships that is exactly this: the weaponized silence. The silence that says, I am punishing you with my absence and I want you to feel it. This is not the silence we are discussing. This silence is not composure. It is aggression wearing composure's clothing, and it produces the opposite of the effects that genuine silence produces. It creates anxiety and resentment rather than respect and draw. It is a form of emotional manipulation that the people who experience it recognize instinctively as manipulation, even when they cannot name it precisely. The silence that generates genuine psychological power in intimate relationships is a completely different quality. It is the silence of a person who is fully present without being reactive, who can hear something difficult without immediately producing a response to manage how they are perceived in the light of it, who can sit with an unresolved tension without rushing to resolve it through speech, who brings to the relationship the same quality of unhurried, undefensive, genuinely available presence that they bring to every other context where silence is their instrument. This quality of silence in an intimate relationship is one of the most attractive things a person can offer another person, because most people have never experienced the specific safety of being with someone who does not need to manage every moment, who does not fill every silence with reassurance or explanation or performance, who simply exists alongside them with completeness and ease, who trusts the relationship enough to be quiet inside it. The draw this creates is profound and often confusing to the person experiencing it. They feel more themselves in the presence of this person, more at ease, less required to perform, less monitored. The silence creates a space in which their own authentic experience can exist without immediately being reflected back to them through another person's anxious speech. The fifth context is the management of your own internal state. This is the dimension of silence that most discussions of it as a power tool entirely miss. Because the silence we have been discussing, the external silence of a person who speaks less and waits longer and holds the charged pause without breaking it, is only sustainable if it is supported by an internal silence that is its source. The person who is externally silent but internally in chaos is performing silence. And performed silence has the same quality of effort that performed confidence has. It is visible. It leaks. The composure on the surface is not quite complete because the surface is being maintained against the pressure of the chaos beneath it. And the gap between the performance and the reality, however small, is perceptible to the attentive observer. The internal silence that produces genuine external composure is something different entirely. It is the silence of a mind that has developed the capacity to observe its own processes without being entirely driven by them, to notice the impulse to speak without automatically acting on it, to feel the discomfort of the charged pause without immediately identifying with the discomfort and treating it as a command, to be present in the moment of social interaction without the running commentary of self-monitoring that splits attention between the external reality and the internal performance. This internal silence is developed through one practice above all others: the practice of sitting with your own experience without immediately processing it through language. In the ordinary moments of daily life, not in social interaction, but in the private spaces between interaction. The moments when you would normally reach for a phone, for a podcast, for any form of input that fills the space between one external stimulation and the next. The moments of genuine quiet in which the mind, left without input to process, begins to do the thing it most needs to do: to settle, to locate its own center of gravity, to develop the relationship with stillness that is the prerequisite of all genuine power. Machiavelli himself was a man of extraordinary interior life, who spent years in enforced withdrawal from the political world he loved. It was in that withdrawal, in the silence of his country estate at Sant'Andrea in Percussina, that he wrote The Prince, that the observations of a lifetime of political engagement were distilled into the clear, cold, precise language of a man who had learned, through deprivation, to be genuinely still, who had discovered in the silence of exile what the noise of political life had prevented him from knowing directly: that the most powerful position available to any human being is the position of the observer, the person who sees clearly because they have learned to be quiet enough to see. The observer position is what all genuine silence is pointing toward, not the performance of withholding, not the tactical deployment of pauses for strategic effect. The actual capacity to be present in any situation, any conversation, any charged and complex human moment from a position of real stillness. A stillness that does not require the situation to be different from what it is. That does not need the conversation to go a particular way. That is not braced against the possibility of discomfort or working to produce the possibility of comfort. That is simply there, present and complete, watching and receiving and responding from a depth that speech produced by anxiety can never reach. This is the level at which silence becomes something more than a tactical tool. At this level, it becomes a mode of being, a way of inhabiting your own life and your own presence in the world that generates, without effort or intention, the quality of authority that the most naturally powerful people you have ever encountered seem to simply possess. They are not performing it. They arrived at it through exactly the practice we have been describing, through the accumulated choice, repeated across years, to be still when the impulse to speak arrived, to wait when the pull to act was strong, to hold the silence when every social instinct said to fill it. And through that accumulated choice, a specific quality of personhood developed. The quality of a person for whom the internal noise has been sufficiently quieted that the signal of genuine thought, genuine perception, genuine response can be heard above it. Everything we have discussed, the silence in negotiation, the composure in conflict, the authority in leadership, the draw in intimacy, the power that accrues to the person who masters this, all of it is downstream from this one practice. The practice of learning to be internally quiet enough that the external silence is not performance but expression, not management but nature. You already have access to this practice. It does not require anything you do not already possess. It requires only the consistent choice, made in the ordinary moments of your daily life, to be still rather than to fill, to wait rather than to rush, to trust the silence rather than to fear it. Because the silence is not empty. It never was. It is full of everything that the noise was preventing you from hearing, full of the information that observation provides when speech is paused long enough for observation to actually happen, full of the other person's truth, visible in the things they say when the space you are providing encourages genuine speech rather than the defensive elaboration that anxious silence produces, full of your own clarity, available when the running commentary of self-monitoring has been quieted enough for the deeper processing to surface, full of the specific quality of presence that changes how people experience you, not because you have done something impressive, because you have stopped doing the thing that was preventing them from experiencing who you actually are when the need to manage yourself has been set down. The silence is not a weapon. It is not a technique. It is not a performance. At its deepest level, it is simply the space in which the most real version of you becomes available to yourself and to everyone present enough to receive it. That version has always been more powerful than the version that speaks to fill the space. It was simply waiting for the noise to stop.